All right, so kind of left off thinking about externalities. Probably at some point tomorrow, I'm guessing early afternoon, I'll get the next homework posted, so you'll be able to kind of start working on that as we cover the material. Obviously, we haven't gone through enough to where you're gonna be able to like complete it or anything, but as we start working through these topics, you can kind of start, get a little bit of a head start on it, or kind of work up to do whatever we cover in class. Okay? So we're talking about negative externalities, right? And I think we ended on, we kind of talked about, we have a normal market that only kind of reflects the cost to the producers in that market. We then said, we can identify the equilibrium price, the equilibrium quantity, but if we had negative externalities, it's essentially like, we get here, oh, there we go. We've got this higher marginal cost to society, right? That includes not only the marginal cost of producers, whatever the cost of this negative thing they're producing is, right? Maybe it's pollution. A lot of times we talk about negative externalities being something like noise, or, I have a sports and time course, and we talk about like, what are negative externalities of having large sports teams in your neighborhood, right? Increasing traffic, which kind of costs time, which, takes more time to commute, which has cost to it, right? So there's lots of these different types of negative externalities. And basically for society, that means that the marginal cost of producing this good is therefore higher, right? Or we kind of see this decrease in our supply curve, which we kind of match up with things we've already talked about. We then said we could identify not only the equilibrium quantity for the market, but also the equilibrium quantity that society would want. Well, society would make its decision based off of where its costs are equal to its benefits. So if we just have negative externalities, they'll make the decision based off of this marginal social cost curve, which includes these negative externalities, and then where that hits the demand curve, which reflects the benefits of having this good. So we said for society, the equilibrium ends up being at a lower point than the market arrived at. So we think about it this way. The market is overproducing from where the society would like the production of this good to be. That overproduction is going to cause some additional costs, right? So we're going to have this deadweight loss, right, which is reflected in this little triangle here. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit more of an insight as to why that's the deadweight loss. I had some questions towards the end of last class, kind of identify, I think, this. If instead of doing everything on one graph, we try to break this up. So let's say we've got our supply curve, our supply curve, and our demand curve, right? And think about this equilibrium quantity, equilibrium price. So where is our producer and kind of consumer surplus here? You kind of think about the area underneath the demand curve, but above the price, we said this would represent kind of consumer surplus. And if we want a producer surplus, well, for them, the benefit was the price. The costs are their costs. So the area in between the price and the supply curve, this is what represented kind of our producer surplus. So you can think about it like this. So let's say I draw this out so that we can kind of compare the quantity, that price. I'll try to draw this kind of similar size here. Got this, and then this thing. Here was kind of our marginal social cost. So you kind of see what total surplus is in the sense that there was no externality. It would just be here's producer, here's consumer surplus, total surplus would be the sum of those. So if we were at the socially efficient point, that would be where marginal social cost hits the marginal benefits or hits the demand curve. This is kind of the equilibrium quantity that was socially efficient, and here would be kind of the socially efficient price. So here, you kind of see consumer surplus would be right here, producer surplus right here. So when we switch to looking at, so the socially efficient point, we went to where the market ended up at. It looks like on its face that almost like we gained all of this surplus, right? If you think about here, I was trying to put this on the same graph, right? All of this here is like added surplus, right? Because if we had just went with a socially optimal point, we ended up with kind of this smaller area. So if we let the market kind of choose this higher quantity, why am I saying that there's also deadweight loss? It looks like we've actually gained quite a bit of surplus here. So the reason is because if we allow the market to choose the quantity, right, not factoring in the social costs, think about what this area would represent. Well, basically the difference between the producer's costs and society's costs, that's just like the value of that negative externality per unit. Right? So if I could put a dollar amount on this, like let's say that every unit produced, we did some research and found that the cost of this pollution or whatever this negative externality is basically it costs society $5 for every additional unit of electricity that's produced. Well, then what's the total cost to society from producing, right, the quantity that the market will arrive at? That would just be $5 for every single unit, right? So we're kind of thinking about it, this area here represents the cost to society. So by allowing the market to produce this higher quantity, yeah, we kind of saw all this additional surplus gain, but it was canceled out by all of this additional cost to society. So it's almost like if we're kind of looking at the change in total surplus from the point that was socially efficient, all of this surplus was canceled out by all of these additional costs. And then we still have these additional costs up here that weren't canceled out from this overproduction of the good. So that's why on that little triangle, right, where we see the overproduction of the good, the difference between society's costs and society's benefits, right, the demand curve reflects the benefits. That's why that little triangle ends up just being our deadweight loss. Right? So it's like, yeah, from this overproduction, there were gains in surplus, but there was also this huge loss from this negative externality. The huge loss kind of overshadowed that gain in surplus, and on net, we were left with like a little bit of additional costs, right? The additional costs were more than the additional benefits from this overproduction. And that's because they didn't factor in, when they were choosing this optimal quantity, they weren't factoring in society's costs, right? They were just factoring in their own production costs. Now, I would never make you reproduce those kind of areas, but knowing that the difference between that social cost and the social benefit curve, now here the social benefit curve is just the same as the private benefit, just the demand curve, because we don't have any positive externalities, right? We just got this negative externality. So this overproduction, that difference in society's costs and society's benefits, that would reflect kind of our deadweight loss, right? Because here, society's costs at these quantities are greater than society's benefits. That's kind of where we left off. We're giving a slightly different look into why that deadweight loss was the area that it is. Any questions kind of over that? I know it's a little bit tough, but for those of you who are kind of wanting to see somewhat of a visualization as to why there is a deadweight loss, that would be kind of how you would look at it. Questions on that? So some of the things that we said, basically we have this additional cost, this negative externality society. The market ignores that additional cost and therefore ends up choosing a production level that's too high. So if we're thinking about here, if I've got a graph, I've got these three kind of, I guess, lines up here, we can identify what each one of them is. Right? So hopefully, we'll kind of walk through this one. We got a couple other questions, but I'll kind of lead us into the next few. So if we've got a $15 social cost for each unit of electricity provided, which of these costs would represent the social cost of electricity? Well, hopefully, right, at this point, we know that anytime we've got like these supply and demand curves, our demand curve is always decreasing. Right? The benefit to consuming something decreases as I consume more and more. So C should be kind of our demand curve, or what we'll start saying, it reflects the private marginal benefits, right? Or the marginal benefits to the consumers of that good. We then know that if we have a negative externality, the social cost at every single quantity will be higher than whatever the production cost will be. So if we're looking here, we've got two cost curves, A and B. We've already identified that C is our demand curve. The one that is lower has to reflect just the private cost, right? Just the cost of producing. So that's kind of our old, basically, it's our supply curve. Right? It reflects the marginal cost of producers. Our marginal social cost would then be this curve B, which is that there's also these additional costs at every single quantity to whatever this negative externality is. So hopefully we're looking at this, we can kind of identify those three. We're kind of writing these in based off what we've done on the board, right? Here's our demand for our private marginal benefit curves. Here's our supply for the private marginal cost of producers. And then B represents these social costs or the marginal social costs, right? Not just the producer's cost, but also these additional costs of society from the production of this good. Okay? So our marginal social cost curve there is B. So what if we were trying to identify something like this, right? We can identify from the previous one, demand, supply, and our marginal social cost curve. What would the price and quantity be that the free market arrives at? Well, we've got kind of the market won't factor in these additional costs, right? So the market is ignoring the social cost curve. The market's just going to arrive at an equilibrium based off of the supply curve, right? Just the producer's costs. So we're kind of looking at this blue line. Right? We then have demand, or the private benefits, is represented by this green line. So the free market is basically just like old supply and demand, right? Where are those two things equal, or where are those two things equal to each other? It looks like here there will be a quantity of 60 and a price of 40. So there we would think about the market will arrive at this quantity of 60 and this price of 40. So without even looking at these graphs, if I told you this is what the market arrives at, and I then tell you that there's some additional social costs here, what do you know has to be true about the quantity that society would like relative to what the free market landed? Right? If I know this equilibrium quantity that the market arrives at is 60, what has to be true about the socially efficient quantity if we have negative externality? It has to be less than that, right? We said that because you're not factoring in the costs, right? You basically decide that there's a higher number of units that are actually worth producing. So notice here, if I'm just looking at the private costs and benefits, for every unit here, the private benefits are greater than the marginal cost. So the market's like, oh yeah, we're definitely going to produce these units, right? Because the benefit's greater than the cost. However, for society, what's actually true about these units here is that the costs are actually greater than the benefits. So if society is making a choice, they say, no, we don't want those produced, right? It's costing society more than it's benefiting society. Right? So anytime we know the free market equilibrium, we always know that there's negative externalities, that society would actually like the quantity to be lower. Right? So here that would imply that the socially efficient quantity should be less than 60. But we could actually say what we want it to be. Right? The socially efficient quantity will actually arrive at wherever the marginal social costs, right, which is like the cost curve, the supply curve, plus these additional negative externalities, these additional costs of society, wherever that hits our demand curve. Because then that would imply we produce up to the point where the marginal benefits to society are greater than the marginal cost of society. Any point past this, we just said, the costs are to be above the benefits. So here, right, thinking about demand, being that green line, This black line or gray line was kind of our marginal social cost. We know that wherever the marginal social costs hit my demand curve or marginal benefits, that's the quantity that society would like it to stop at, kind of where they would like equilibrium to be, which looks like here, we get a quantity and price of fixed. Okay? So I wasn't using these to get the answers here, but once again, and as we go to the final, going back to the slide and looking at these slides that have eye clickers on them, always good additional practice to make sure you know how you would be able to solve a problem like that going into the final. Okay. Any questions over anything there? Okay. So what if, it's kind of hard to see here. What if I asked you what is the value of deadweight loss? Right? So we've got these negative externalities. The government doesn't step in at all, but we allow the free market to kind of get to that market equilibrium, right? The equilibrium that ignores the additional social costs. How would I find that deadweight loss? So we said the deadweight loss is going to come from the overproduction of this good. So here's where society would like the equilibrium quantity to be. Here's the quantity that the free market arrives at. For every quantity here, from this overproduction, right, from society's efficient point, the difference between the cost to society and the benefits to society, the difference between the marginal social cost curve and then our demand curve, this would represent the loss of surplus, right? Because costs are greater than benefits in that range. So how would we come up with what this value of deadweight loss is? Well, if we were able to identify what that value is, we come up with the height of our triangle. We know the base of our triangle, just that difference in quantity, and it's a triangle, so we would multiply by half. So if I'm looking at this, right, we kind of represent this little triangle right here. So it looks like the height here would be at 55. The low part here is at 40. So the height of our triangle would just be what, 555 minus 40, so 15. And then the base of our triangle is basically how many units are we overproducing? Well, we said earlier, the market arrives at 60, society wanted at 50. So kind of the difference there would be 10. So 150 times 10, it's a triangle. So then the final step would be multiply by half. We kind of see, I'm going to use this here, right? Basically the overproduction of these 10 units, the difference between marginal social costs and the demand curve would represent this triangle right here. So we're basically just looking for this point and this point to determine the height of that triangle, this point and this point, right, to get our base. And the area of a triangle, 1/2 times base times height. Questions there? All right, so I'm setting us up for kind of the next thing. I probably expect you guys to maybe do some more of this work on your own. We'll kind of get to those graphs after we talk about positive. So for positive externalities, it's going to be the exact opposite of negative externalities in that it's not additional cost to society. It's going to be additional benefits. So I guess if we do negative externalities, we said the quantity was too high. Right? So if I'm thinking before I even work through this, if we got positive externalities, what do you think is probably true about positive externalities? Wherever the market equilibrium is probably at a quantity that is too low. Intuitively, it kind of makes sense. They're not factoring in all the benefits of production, so they stop production at a point that's too low. Right? Because we know that marginal benefits are declining, but if I'm not factoring in all of the marginal benefits, when I compare the benefits to the cost, I'm going to think that at certain quantities, well, now the cost has surpassed the benefits. But that's because I wasn't factoring in all the benefits that exist. So let's think about here. Let's not use this black one. See if this one runs a little bit better. dime. So, oh, this one's actually, I like that one. So we've got quantity, price here. Got my demand curve, which reflects my marginal benefits. My supply curve, which reflects my marginal costs. So we're going to do no negative externalities now. We're going to think about positive externalities. So without any externality, the market will arrive at this equilibrium of price and quantity, right? Wherever supply is equal to demand. They factor in the private cost of producers and the private cost to the consumers of this good. However, with positive externalities, basically for every unit that's consumed, right? For every unit that's produced in the market and consumed by someone, that there's benefits to society. So we said like one of these would be like education, right? You getting a college degree benefits society, not just you and the university. Immunizations, right? This just benefit you and the seller of the immunization, but people around you. So we have a lot of these examples of positive externalities. So basically before we said negative externalities were additional costs. Positive externalities are additional benefits. So it's like I've got this private benefit, but at every single unit, there's this additional benefit to society from that unit being produced and consumed. So the marginal social benefit curve is actually going to be higher, right? Or kind of like when we were thinking about that increase in demand. Because at every single quantity, they weren't factoring in this additional benefit to society. So you can almost think about this as the marginal social benefit is whatever the marginal benefit was to the consumer plus this external benefit, right? This benefit that's existing to somebody else that's not involved in the market. Okay? And I guess if we go back, you wanted to think about marginal social costs. We're like taking the marginal cost of the producer and then adding in some external costs as well. Okay? And that's why we kind of have that decrease in our supply curve. We think about it. So if we were to factor in this additional benefit, where would society like the production of this good to get to? Well, they're setting their benefits, society's benefits equal to society's costs. Well, now society's costs are just the producer's costs because we don't have any negative externalities. So it'd be that supply curve, for the marginal cost of producing the good, are exactly equal to society's benefits, or society's marginal benefits, I guess if you want to say it that way. So you are looking still at the margin. So the socially efficient point and the socially efficient price that would be set, right? We can see that we're not producing enough of this good, or we're producing underneath the socially efficient quantity, and the price of this good is being set below the socially efficient price. So here, if we see an underproduction of this good, it actually is a little bit easier to identify our deadweight loss in the sense that it kind of looks more like what we were doing when we saw things like taxes and pricing, the price boards, and we're doing that. But because we now have this underproduction of the good, so basically our deadweight losses, all of this surplus that we were losing out on by not producing this higher quantity, right? So the difference between my costs, actually, so this underproduction, right? We're losing out on all this additional surplus that would have been gained with the additional benefits to society, because we're actually stopping. We're not actually getting to this point. If we were to continue to this point, we would gain all this additional surplus. So I think about positive externalities. You can kind of write this as the private value. Do I have it up here? No. So I have right here, right? It's the private benefits plus this additional benefit to somebody outside of this market, right? Someone who's not a producer or not a consumer of this good. Okay. So we were looking at the graph here, and we have this up on the board, right? We're going to end up at a free market quantity that's below what society would want it. I think about we're actually going to have we get additional benefits. Sorry. So this area here is going to represent our deadweight loss. The overproduction of this good, the difference between society's costs and society's benefits, that's going to reflect what we're missing out. Sorry about that. So this is going to be additional costs that are overweighted by additional benefits. So when we have the underproduction, what we're losing out on is you see this kind of little area that we're lost here. So you can think about just like when I was drawing out the other area before, you have this huge kind of surplus that you're losing out on, but you also have that kind of overweighted by some additional costs. Kind of the net benefit of the two is going to be that we end up with this kind of deadweight loss here. So we think about negative externalities, positive externalities, they both lead to less than socially efficient outcomes, right? They both lead to outcomes where we have some deadweight loss or we haven't maximized total surplus for society, okay? Now, that's a little different than maximizing surplus for just that market, right? The market actually has its surplus maximized when it ignores the social costs and benefits, okay? But for society, total surplus is at a loss if we just allow the free market to get to their point of maximizing their surplus. You got to think about like if sometimes private incentives, like personal incentives, don't align with what's best for society, right? So, if I am incredibly, let's say I don't have a job, I have zero housing, right? I have no money. For me, the personal incentive, right, to rob a store for food is insanely high. It is the optimal decision for me, right? Otherwise, I'm going to go hungry, potentially, have these huge negative effects of living out. So it might be beneficial for me to rob, I'm not saying morally it's right, but in the terms of personal decisions for that person, it's what's optimal, right? But for society, right, there's going to be these huge costs to the damage they do. And so for society, it wouldn't be necessarily maximizing surplus. Right? So the kind of the idea here, right? The producers and consumers that exist in the market, they're making decisions that are best for them. They're not factoring in that those might have positive or negative implications to society. Okay? So we think about here, this one hopefully should be easy based on what we did before. If I've got this external benefit, right? So here we've got this blue line represents our supply curve or the marginal cost of producers. Here we've got this black line, which reflects just the demand curve or the marginal benefits to consumers. And then this green line, which reflected that at every quantity for society, there's some additional benefits, right? So that higher curve here, that green curve, represents marginal social benefits or the marginal benefits that exist to society. Okay? So based off of identifying those three, what price and quantity would be the equilibrium if we let the free market decide, right? So they ignore kind of social costs or social benefits here of this positive externality. Where would the free market kind of choose the equilibrium to be? I'll give you like 30, 45 seconds kind of to do this one. Shouldn't be too bad based off what we did before. And notice we're going up by 20, so the mid ticks here are 10. All right, so it looks like we got just about everybody in here. If you haven't gotten an answer in, take your best guess. We got 31 of us here today. Okay, 32. All right, I'm going to close it out. So, what should the free market equilibrium price and quantity be here? So we're going to look at where do those demand curve, the private marginal benefits, hit the private marginal costs, right? So that was going to be where supply is equal to demand. So it's at a quantity of 30 and a price of 50. Yeah. Oh, that is not 50/50, is it? That's from the previous one. Hold on. I'll move this one. I post a complete one. This is on the right one here. I had an issue and I was moving these around before. See, I think this one's off a little bit too. So we'll see. I might have to move all of these. So there we go, right? Quantity of 30, net price of 50. If I'm thinking about the socially optimal pricing quantity, right? So this would be society factors in these additional benefits and makes the decision based off this marginal social benefit curve. So if we do that, where would the optimal quantity and price be for society? Okay. We'll give you a little bit of time to identify that one. Hopefully, after identifying where the market arrives at, it would be a little bit easier to identify where society would like this quantity and price to be. All right, so the previous one we said the free market arrived at that quantity of 30, price of 50. So where would society want it to be? Give you a little bit of time to kind of look at that graph, identify that equilibrium, and we'll kind of talk through it. So help me get a gauge for how close we're following along to this too. All right. So we haven't gotten an answer in. I think we had 32 before. So there we go. Make sure you get your answers in. I'm going to close it out. This one's definitely up. I can already see. Oh, no, it's not. I thought it was in between answers before. But, right, that socially efficient price and quantity. We now factor in the additional benefits. It's going to be wherever society's marginal benefit curve hits that supplier marginal cost curve. It's going to get this quantity of 40, price of 60. Okay. Any questions on that? How we identify kind of society's equilibrium point versus kind of where the free market would arrive at? Okay. So let's think about, we know that these two things don't line up. Okay. So how can I get the free market quantity or equilibrium point to match up with what society would want, right? Because if I just don't step in, and this is a lot of times, you know, up to this point, I've pretty much just shown you how government regulation or intervention makes things worse. But here we've actually got some scenarios where we can now show the government can step in here. We can actually get to that socially efficient point. Okay? So how are we going to do that? Using taxes and subsidies. So let's kind of revisit. Well, I guess it's weird now. We'll start out with positive externalities, and then we'll go back and we'll get negative externalities as well. So if I've got my demand curve, got my supply curve. We said, let's say we got positive externalities such that the marginal social benefit, right, at every quantity, we kind of had this external benefit, right? So we said marginal social benefit just takes the consumer's marginal benefit plus this additional benefit to the consumption or production of that good. Right, that gave us the new marginal social benefit. So that existed at every single quantity, right? That was like the difference between the ones. So we know that we would like to get to this socially efficient quantity. But the problem is the consumers in this market, they aren't taking into consideration when they're making their purchase decision, not only their benefits, but the benefits to other people, which, I mean, why should they, right? It doesn't benefit them unless there's some type of like moral benefit from like knowing that you're doing the right thing, which probably to a degree, we could probably build that in the model. But let's assume that the consumer doesn't even know this additional benefit exists. Right? So I think that, you know, if we're thinking about education decisions, most people go to college because they believe it's going to benefit their lives. They don't do it because they believe it's going to benefit other people in society, right? And maybe there's a degree to that where they know they're going to produce a product that's good for society, but they don't really make the decision. They look at how much it's going to cost. They look at potential career outcomes there. And so it's unlikely they're actually going to factor in these additional benefits. So how can we get them to do that? Right? What's one thing, and there is usually it's somewhat need-based as well, but there are a lot of grants that the government gives, and they make them fairly easy to get. So most of you, I'm assuming, don't raise your hand, but like I know when I was like Pell grants and then all these other kind of subsidies essentially from the government. Not only just those grants, but what does the government also subsidize? So that makes it easier. Yeah, they subsidize loans. Right? So the government wants to subsidize this good of public education because they believe people aren't factoring in these additional benefits that exist in society from having a more educated populace. Right? So they want to subsidize this market. So subsidizing the market, what's that going to do? That means that every single unit consumed, right, there's this additional benefit, right? Whatever money, right, or whatever I'm going to get from the government. Excuse me. Now, I kind of drew it up here, right? So let's say they try to subsidize this market, and the value of the subsidies they get. So, there we go. Demand plus this subsidy. Right? So maybe they don't quite get it high enough, right? But they start to subsidize this good. Where's the new equilibrium point? Well, now decisions are made factoring in this additional benefit, because now if I consume this good, I get whatever my old private benefit was, my marginal benefit, but I also get this additional subsidy. So at every single unit, right, there's this additional subsidy that will kind of push my equilibrium quantity that the free market, here was kind of the old equilibrium. With this subsidy, we were able to push the new equilibrium out a little bit. And notice, okay, maybe I got it wrong on the first go around, but if I increase this subsidy enough, I can get it so that that marginal social benefit is exactly equal to the demand curve plus this subsidy, right? So I keep increasing the subsidy, I'm just going to keep pushing that demand curve out until it exactly matches up with what society benefits are. So we call this, I've kind of internalized the benefit to the consumers in this market. I've subsidized them, so I've gave them this additional benefit so that they make decisions internalizing whatever that additional benefit to society is. Because they now also have the incentive of that benefit, which is this subsidy. So I'm looking at this, and it might be kind of hard to see because there are a lot of things going on. What would the optimal value of the subsidy be here? So it would get me up to this optimal point, the socially efficient point, but the actual value of the subsidy I'd want to set exactly equal to whatever that positive externalities value was, or whatever that value of external benefit was. Because that was just the difference between my demand curve and the marginal social benefit curve. So that's how much I want to push up that demand curve. So what's the difference between those two lines? It would just be value of that external benefit. So if I can set the subsidy exactly equal to that external benefit, I can essentially get that socially efficient quantity. Okay. So I'm going to do the taxes first. Let's see if I can. There we go. So, right, I can force consumers to internalize this externality. So let's say these additional incentives. Well, if I can set that subsidy exactly equal to that external benefit, then I've basically gotten to that socially efficient one. Wait, this one's still talking about taxes. Do I have a slide here for? Might have jumped the gun. Well, so I jumped the gun on subsidies. All of this is going to be related to taxes. But basically, I'm thinking about this. My optimal subsidy is the optimal external benefit. The exact opposite is going to be true for my costs, right? If I can set optimal cost of tax, it would be exactly equal to whatever that external cost is, right? So subsidy I set to the external benefit. Tax I can set to that external cost. So we'll walk through kind of what that would look like as well. So let's say I've got demand curve. I've got my supply curve. And I've got a marginal social cost, which is taking the producer's cost, but also adding in this additional external cost as well. So for society, we would like to be out here at this socially efficient quantity. I'll move out of the way in a second. However, the market, right, is kind of existing at this point is a little bit higher than what we would like as society. So what happens? Well, we want to try to get that supply curve now to match up with what the actual cost of society is, right? Currently, it's only taking in the private marginal costs, right? It's not factoring in the additional external costs. Well, what's the difference between our supply curve, which represents marginal costs, and the marginal social cost curve, which is just the additional cost of society, right? So if we think about kind of the difference between here is just the external cost. So what's one way I can kind of decrease my supply curve? I can start to tax that good, right? As I add taxes to the supply curve, it'll kind of move backwards, right? As I increase the tax more and more. How can I get my supply curve plus the tax to be exactly equal to the marginal social cost? Well, that's if I just take my supply curve and if the value of the tax is exactly equal to that external cost. So it's the same idea as what we had for the external benefits, right? An optimal subsidy, try and get it so it's set exactly equal to the external benefits. The difference between that demand curve and the marginal social benefit. What's the optimal tax? If I can set it equal to the difference between my marginal cost curve and my marginal social cost curve, which would just be the value of that external cost or that negative externality. So in practice, it's going to be kind of hard to do this. I mean, in the sense of I have to be able to put a dollar amount, right, on the negative and positive externality. But if I can, right, the ideal tax would be setting it exactly equal to the value of that negative externality per unit. And then the ideal subsidy would be able to set it exactly equal to the additional benefit for each unit produced, for each unit consumed of that good. So a lot of times what this looks like is, you know, I could probably come up with some dollar amount on the total amount of pollution that's created from coal-powered electricity plants, and then look at how many units of electricity they're producing, whether it's like a kilowatt, something or others, right? And then I take the total divided by the total amount produced, and that would tell me like the tax on each unit that I would need to do to exactly match up with whatever those external costs of society are. Now, the external benefits, probably a little bit harder to really get a perfectly corrected subsidy there, just because it's usually hard to measure the benefits to things like education or immunization. You know, maybe with immunization it's a little bit easier because, you know, with the help of an epidemiologist, you can figure out like rates of spread and things like that. But even if you have that, it's going to be not a real easy matter to come up with a dollar amount. So that's essentially what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to evaluate the costs and benefits that exist from this market, and then taking the total quantity that you see kind of produced on that market, take the total cost or benefit divided by the total quantity, and that's how much each unit you should either tax if it's a negative externality, or how much you should subsidize it if there's an external benefit. So a lot of times, if you look back, this idea goes really way far back, and it's kind of called Pogovian taxes, right? And you call getting consumers and producers to make decisions based off of these external costs and benefits. That's what we were calling, where was it? There we go. Internalizing the externality. Okay? So if you can get them to internalize these additional costs and benefits, right, then maybe, right, you get to that socially efficient quantity. So one of the main ways we see this, so I put an example, I think, I said in our example, but I didn't really put a specific good here. But somewhere where we see these corrected taxes being attempted to be used is in the gasoline market, right? If we think that there's a lot of pollution going on, and so we want to kind of decrease the use of automobiles and the production of all this additional pollution, well, maybe we start taxing gasoline, right? We tax gasoline, we internalize this cost to you and me, the people who are actually buying the gas. we then can kind of push that supply curve back a little bit, making each producer's kind of taxing the unit, and maybe we get to the social efficient quantity, which is that fewer people are driving as much. There's just less gasoline production. What do I have here? Oh, well, the other one that we could do, I glossed over this. And so the market-based policy is probably the one that we would see enacted here in the US. Command and control would be, the government comes in and says, well, we see that there's overproduction of this good. We know that we want to get this lower quantity. So instead of internalizing the cost to our consumers or our people, we're just going to say, yeah, you can't produce it. We're just going to tell the government, we're going to limit production, right? We see that a little bit more in other economies where there's maybe not as much, the government has a little bit more control over markets. So it should look more like Russia 30, 40 years ago or something like that. But it is a possibility, right? These command and control economies, the government could just come in and say, look, we know that we're over and underproducing, so we're just going to set quotas if we want to see overproduction, or we're going to set kind of limits if we want to see a lower quantity target. But probably a more democratic way of getting at it is using these taxes and subsidies so that we can get the producers and consumers incentives to align with, right, or we can get them to internalize the value of these externalities. Any questions on any of this? So, so if we're thinking about some kind of takeaways, I might have something in a second, but so we have negative externalities. Kind of our corrective measure was a tax. Kind of optimal one would be a tax that's exactly equal to the external cost. For these positive externalities, that was using a subsidy and trying to set that exactly equal to the external benefit. So we kind of push those quantities closer to that social efficiency. So we're going to say before we get out of here to that, we will probably revisit these just to review a little bit, have a couple more examples of what we could do to regulate markets that have positive and negative externalities. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with an idea, right? That what if we had a market where we had positive and negative externalities? So we've got our supply curve, we've got our demand curve, right? What if I had negative externalities that existed? Not all my markets are down. So what if we had, there we go, negative externalities, while at the same time we had positive externalities as well. Right? Well, maybe we don't have to worry too much about this, because if we had positive and negative externalities, if for some reason we ended up with a situation where the external costs and external benefits were exactly equal to each other, notice the point that society would like is actually the same point in terms of quantity that the market would arrive. Right? So if we have competing externalities, we don't have to be as concerned in those markets about deadweight loss. However, if we only have one of them, right, then we might want to be a lot more concerned. That's where some taxes and subsidies to attempt to get that social efficient quantity. So tomorrow, look for that next homework. You can probably start working through some of the game theory questions as well as some of the externality stuff. We'll kind of continue with externalities and we'll probably finish that up on Wednesday and progress later. Okay? All right, I'll see you guys on Wednesday. If you didn't get your exam back, by the way, I do have them, not with me, but in my office. So if you want to stop by during office hours to get those, I would suggest doing that. And I'll try to bring them Wednesday as well. So, yeah, especially, I don't know, if you want to set up a different time, that's more than okay.
Okay.
Yeah, just send me an email probably the week before exams, and then we'll get some set up. Send it over there.
I was just because I have to like take my math test there.
Oh, okay.
Since